Sir Roger Casement was hanged for treason in 1916. His conviction rested on a set of sinister sex diaries. But were they faked? Earlier this week, the results of a scientific investigation were finally announced. Now, BBC 4 solves the mystery at last.
One moves here in an atmosphere of crime, suspicion, lying and mistrust in the open, and in the background, these revolting and dastardly murders of helpless Indians. If ever there was a helpless people on the face of this earth, it is these naked forest savages, mere grown-up children.
These words were written in 1910 by Sir Roger Casement, one of the most remarkable and enigmatic figures in British and Irish history. In an era of colonial excess, Casement became the conscience of the empire, a fearless campaigner who almost single-handedly invented the modern concept of human rights.
He was committed passionately to justice, to the ending of exploitation, and in that way he was a trailblazer.
But Casement was also a political radical, devoted to the cause of Irish independence. In 1916, he was accused of plotting with the Germans to start a rebellion in Ireland that would have changed the course of the First World War. Public figures, including Arthur Conan Doyle, appealed for leniency. But then came an astonishing revelation. Within the pages of these 5 innocuous-looking diaries are the explicit details that exposed Casement as a promiscuous homosexual and effectively silenced his supporters. Known as the Black Diaries, they have been the subject of bitter controversy ever since.
4th September 1911. Met Stanley Weeks, 20 years. Bathed together first 9 a.m. Huge one. Then 12:45, huger still. Hung down, curved and swollen and wanted awfully.
Shrouded in secrecy for almost 80 years, the diaries have become infamous, not only for what they contain, but because of repeated accusations that they were forged to eliminate opposition to Casement's execution. But if, as some historians believe, they are genuine, the issue is not British foul play, but Irish prejudice.
The diaries have been controversial in the past for all kinds of reasons, but they're controversial now because there is a sad section, sad in my view, of the Irish Republican movement which still can't accept that gays can be heroes.
The British government has now agreed to a scientific study that will attempt to settle the issue.
Well, the question which everybody wants an answer to is, are these diaries the work of Roger Casement alone, or on the other hand, can we prove that they are in part or in total forgeries? If that's the case, they will certainly be the work of British intelligence.
Under the direction of Professor McCormack, a forensic examination commissioned for this program will put the forgery theory to the test.
Forensic scientists are trained in deciding whether handwritings are genuine or otherwise, and that's the expertise that I'm bringing to this process, is to actually use my training and the equipment in my laboratory to actually answer the question, did Roger Casement write the entries in these diaries, or are they forgeries?
This first ever forensic analysis will at last reveal the secrets of the Black Diaries. The conspiracy for which Casement was eventually executed was international in scope and breathtaking in its boldness. In 1916, as the British and German armies fought to a standstill on the Western Front, a U-boat delivered Casement ashore on the southwest coast of Ireland. Anchored further out to sea was a ship carrying 20,000 German rifles to arm a planned Easter uprising that would drive the British out of Ireland. But at the critical moment, the plan was foiled. Casement was captured not far from where he landed. The arms ship was intercepted by the Royal Navy and sank herself.
Well, it was an appalling tragedy and disaster for the family in a sense, because my grandfather and his 4 brothers, for example, were all fighting for the British in the war. And, you know, this was just a disaster to have a member of their family being arrested as a traitor and taken off to the Tower of London to be tried. And it is completely, I suppose, blighted, if you like, the family's perception of Sir Roger Casement for 2, nearly 3 generations.
The Easter Rising went ahead in Dublin without Casement or his German rifles. The military victory he had planned for became instead a symbolic gesture of defiance by a small group of Irish nationalists. 15 of the rebels were executed by the British Army. Casement was charged with treason. The penalty was death. But because of his long career as a champion of the oppressed, many influential friends now came to his aid.
There was a wide group of people who felt Casement, whatever he's done, shouldn't hang. George Bernard Shaw was one of Casement's staunchest partisans. Conan Doyle, for example. These were 2 of several writers who felt that Casement had acted honourably and deserved to be treated with some leniency, deserved a reprieve.
But behind the scenes, the authorities were taking steps to destroy Casement's reputation. Incriminating diary pages were passed to public figures and opinion formers. Casement was being outed.
From the British point of view, Casement, as the person of highest social standing mixed up in the Easter Rising, if he were pardoned, it would look as if it was one law for gentlemen and another for ordinary people. The cabinet decided, Lord Samuel, the last survivor of it, told my father, we were all united, Casement had to hang. There could be no question of his being got off on a reprieve, despite the fact that George V, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope, John Redmond, the leader of the Irish Nationalists, all were clamouring for a reprieve. And yet they were absolutely insistent that he must hang. Now, this meant, therefore, that the presence of the diaries were a godsend.
It wasn't as if they were splashed across the newspapers. It was a case of nobbling influential people who might be able to strengthen the cause for a reprieve, to undermine the self-confidence of those who did persist in demanding a reprieve.
Polite society was scandalized and sympathy for Casement all but snuffed out as word spread about exactly what was in the diaries.
25th November 1911. Back at 7:50 for Jose. He came at 8:10 and we started Spanish exercises. My hand on muscles and I felt it often. Then got him to stand against wall and to measure. And it was up and I put my hand on it often and felt it swelling and stiff. He wanted awfully, blushing and loving and gleaming eyes.
It certainly put off the Archbishop of Canterbury from supporting a plea for clemency. It also alienated John Redmond, the leader of the Irish National Party. And generally it created an air of something between embarrassment and revulsion.
The diary extracts had the desired effect. The campaign for clemency was stopped in its tracks. Casement was executed at Pentonville Jail on the 3rd of August 1916, but the sense of injustice and suspicion has never gone away.
Ever since the Rising, many Irish nationalists have been outraged by what they see as the traducing of a heroic Irishman. Most Irish nationalists have felt that the diaries were forged, that he was doubly executed, first hanged and then his reputation destroyed, traduced by what was widely seen as a forgery.
In fact, the diaries are so dense and complex that Professor McCormack, director of the forensic investigation, has a difficult task ahead.
The contents of these books is remarkably varied, both in terms of the kind of implements used for writing, the way in which writing is inscribed on pages. There are underlinings, there are emphases added. He is a man who not only writes his diary, but reads it and rewrites it. He's a man who will keep his diary in different ways as his mood changes. I think even changes within the course of a day. So you find a particular day, for instance, the 28th of March, 1903, you have writing in two quite distinct hands. Perhaps the most unusual of the volumes is the ledger. Some of the entries are in pencil, some of the entries are in ink, some of them certainly relate to sexual activity, others involve, for instance, buying wedding presents, sending postcards, having a glass of whiskey, other perfectly mundane daily activities.
In a case involving such sensitive allegations, suspicions of British foul play are almost inevitable. As a result, two distinct histories of the Diaries scandal have grown up.
The two views, of course, of Sir Roger Casement. I think they agree nowadays on one thing, which is that he was a hero who gave his life for Irish independence. What they disagree on is whether he was gay or not. Now, those people who accept the authenticity of the Casement diaries, myself included, I think take the view that what he did was to keep those diaries for the purposes of sexual gratification. The other view is that, of course, absolutely impossible that an Irish nationalist hero should be gay, therefore British intelligence must have made up this pornography.
The body of Roger Casement lies in state, draped in the flag of his country. For 4 days, the people of Ireland have filed past his coffin.
From his execution in Pentonville in 1916 to his reburial in Dublin in 1965 and to the present day, Casement has been a crucial focus in the difficult relationship between Britain and Ireland. The truth about the life and death of Roger Casement lies within the pages of the Black Diaries. The task of uncovering it has fallen to Dr. Audrey Giles, an internationally respected expert in the field of document forensics.
What Professor McCormack's asked me to do is to examine these 5 documents to determine if there is any element of alteration or forgery associated with them. There are 3 possibilities here. Firstly, that all of the diaries are written in entirety by Roger Casement himself. The second possibility, that all of the diaries were written by someone other than Roger Casement. So that would mean they would be entirely forged. And the third possibility is that parts of them are genuine Roger Casement writings which have been added to.
As well as the Black Diaries, Dr. Giles has examples of Casement's genuine handwriting in the form of letters held by the London School of Economics. The writing in these undisputed documents will be compared directly to the suspect diaries.
One of the first important things to do is to understand the nature of the undisputed handwriting. Here's one of his letters to his friend Morel. And here we've just got the writing of the words "my dear." And already we've got several important character forms to look at. Here we've got the character D, quite an unusual formation. The bowl here is a thin structure, and then the exiting stroke moves upwards and ends in an upwards direction with this big loop over to the left-hand side here, so that the character almost leans back over itself. And we see here one of the characteristics which we see throughout Roger Casement's handwriting. That's the tendency to join words together with a continual stroke. If we look at the name here, Morel, again we've got some characteristic features. Particularly we've got this character E, this Greek form E written in a single stroke. Now normally you'd see that as the capital letter at the beginning of a word, but Roger Casement consistently uses this form even within a word. And here we've got the word suggestion, and particularly this form of the character S, very flattened and very broad horizontally. Having thoroughly examined the undisputed writings of Roger Casement, I'm now going to move to look at the questioned writings and actually seeing whether the character forms here match those in our undisputed writings. And straight away we can pick up some similarities here. The character E, which we discussed with the capital form written in the middle of the word, here we got it written in the middle of the word lovely. The way in which words are joined together with curved strokes, here straight in A, lovely. The character D, ending with an upward stroke, here we've got two examples. And if we just move a little way along, outrageous here, and the character S, this flattened form which we've seen before. Here we've got similarities between the writings of Roger Casement and the questioned writings. I've only shown you a few character forms, but in my examinations I'm going to go through every single character form to decide whether they are similar or they are different, and what the balance is between similarities and differences in these two sets of handwritings.
The mystery of the Black Diaries is only one of the extraordinary features of Roger Casement's story. His was a life of extreme contrasts and contradictions. He was born in Dublin in 1864. His mother, Anne, had all her 4 children baptized into the Catholic Church. But she died when Roger was 9, and he was brought up as an Ulster Protestant in County Antrim, at the family seat at Magdalen Temple.
His father was not a great family man, I suspect. He wasn't very good at practicalities of life, and he found it almost impossible to look after 3 boys and a girl, and he effectively farmed them out to his relations. And as far as we can make out, Sir Roger came to live here in this house when he was about 10 in 1874. And he came to live here with my great-great-grandfather, John Casement, and his second wife, Charlotte. And I think it was probably quite a difficult household in which to grow up as a young boy. They were very strict, austere people, very moral, if you like. It's known that they took the pledge, so they didn't drink. And judging from the sort of house that they built, they were trying to make some sort of statement as to their sort of solidity and their worth in the community, as it were. And judging from the sort of person Sir Roger was, it didn't really quite figure with his view of the world. I think he was substantially a very romantic person.
As soon as he could, Casement escaped the austerity of Magdalen Temple. At the age of 19, he joined a trading ship traveling to West Africa, which is where he would spend the next 20 years, working as a customs officer, as a trading post manager, and as a surveyor, mapping the still uncharted African interior. He seems to have felt completely at home in the harshest of environments. Joseph Conrad, author of Heart of Darkness, met Casement in West Africa in 1890. He recorded in his diary, "There is a touch of the conquistador in him too, for I have seen him start off into an unspeakable wilderness swinging a crook-handled stick for all weapons. A few months afterwards, it so happens that I saw him come out again, a little leaner, a little browner, and quietly serene, as though he had been for a stroll in the park." Casement became a British consul in 1895 and was soon renowned for his devotion to duty and for his sympathetic nature.
One of his colleagues in Niger said, "We call old Roger the black man's friend." I think the origins of his sympathy for the indigenous population would be twofold. First of all, there was something in his personality makeup which drove him that way. He made a statement himself somewhat later saying, "I'm always for the underdog." I think the other component is probably his Irishness. He again made a much quoted comment about seeing the Congo population through the eyes of a hunted race, another hunted race, namely the Irish. So I think his Irishness and his sympathy for another colonized people, coincided.
Casement's sympathies for the Congo population would bring him into direct conflict with their colonial master, King Leopold of Belgium. Leopold relied for his personal wealth on the ivory trade and on rubber, which was extracted by native workers from trees growing wild in the jungle. When Casement began to hear rumors of atrocities being committed against the native people, he decided to investigate.
We have here 2 baskets from the Congo that Sir Roger brought back here in, well, they're dated 1903. He actually acquired them. These baskets represent a load of rubber. A worker was expected to bring in 154 of these basketfuls per week. That's the larger one. We suspect this was probably a child's load, the smaller one. Soon after he arrived in the Congo, he realized that the natives were being treated as slaves, effectively, and he became utterly incensed, I think, by what he saw, and he felt that this was such an injustice that had to be righted. And he saw it as his role to expose this to the world.
It was fairly straightforward. If these people didn't deliver the rubber, lots of it, and quickly, the penalty was usually either a hand struck off or a foot struck off, or your child's hand or foot struck off. Many people have thought that Casement was exaggerating with these stories, but there is ample evidence, photographic evidence, that these things really happened.
In May 1903, his personal investigation finally became an official inquiry. Travelling alone along the river, a fearless Casement relayed his impressions back directly to the Foreign Secretary in London.
The natives have been handed over to a gang of unscrupulous plunderers and are reduced to a condition of such servitude and unhappiness as I could not have believed possible had I not seen it with my own eyes.
Having acted on his own impulse to expose the horrors of the Congo, Casement went further than any official had ever dared in challenging the basic assumptions of empire.
He believed in an ethical foreign policy, that Britain's role, the United Kingdom's role, should be, among many other things, to right wrongs in the world. And he has been described as a knight-errant in search of a cause, and he found several causes in the course of his life. He couldn't understand employers, foreign secretaries and establishments which didn't share these priorities.
The Foreign Office, afraid of offending Leopold, dithered, so Casement set up a pressure group, the Congo Reform Association, to influence public opinion directly. The steady stream of devastating revelations was more than King Leopold could withstand. In 1907, he was forced to surrender control of the Congo. Casement had won an historic victory.
He really changed the whole attitude to native peoples. He gave birth to the idea that these places must, to some extent at least, be governed for the benefit of the indigenous population. That it was not just a company comes out here, takes what the devil it likes, and the profits are all reaped in London or somewhere else. The emphasis was now that colonies should actually profit from colonization instead of being just slave states.
He was an intelligent man. He was also an extremely emotional man. And I think the emotion has two sides. It has a positive and negative side. I mean, the positive side was that he saw injustices, he saw suffering and cruelty, and he could not stand that and put himself on the line to oppose it. I think the negative side of the emotionalism is that it sometimes clouded his judgment. He could get into furies, he could rant, he could get depressed.
And if the Black Diary from 1903 is to be believed, Casement was already enjoying casual homosexual encounters. He was also recording them.
Here in the 1903 diary, we've got the entry for October the 11th, which can be said to contain some material which is contentious. I'm looking particularly here at the wordings enormous and stiff. And what I'm going to do again is compare this entry directly with an example of Roger Casement's undisputed handwriting. The bottom of the screen here, we can see the entries from the diary, and at the top of the screen, writings from the letter from 1904. If we just go to the letter S, curved top, very short, sharp exiting stroke, highly angled. And also we can look at the F with a deep loop, the descending stroke, and a much smaller loop, just a retrace on the incoming stroke. And here in the undisputed writing, again a deep loop, the descending stroke, no loop in the upper area of the character form. We can see that there are similarities, and we have to think about how those similarities have arisen. One explanation is that they are similar because they are the writings of Roger Casement. A second possibility, of course, is that they are similar because somebody else has written this wording whilst simulating Roger Casement's handwriting.
After his triumph in Africa, Casement's reputation as a fearless investigator was firmly established, so that when reports began to appear of similar atrocities in the Putumayo region of South America, he was the natural choice to lead the official inquiry. In September 1910, Casement arrived in Iquitos, which was then in its heyday as the capital of the Peruvian rubber trade. Iquitos is a city in the middle of the jungle, and the entire region was effectively run by a man called Julio Arana. Arana and the other rubber barons were making fortunes for themselves and their British masters, but they were not anxious to have their methods investigated, which made Casement their natural enemy.
He was in some danger there because the Arana brothers and the Arana family and in-laws were very much in control of the region, and it was almost, again, rather like Leopold had controlled through soldiers the Congo. In fact, the Arana brothers had tremendous power in this region, and it was a lawless region. Anyone could have taken him out. I think he was an extraordinarily brave man to go there.
29 September 1910. Poor Indians. Everything they like, everything that to them means life. And such joy as this dim forest at the end of the world can furnish is not theirs, but belongs to this gang of cutthroat half-castes. Their wives, their children, are the sport and playthings of these ruffians. They, fathers of families, are marched in, guarded by armed ruffians, to be flogged on their naked bodies before the terrified eyes of their wives and children.
Comparing the Congo and the Putumayo, I think the atrocities in the Putumayo were actually worse. The most systematic, I suppose, was the flogging. There were a number of cases where people were suspended over fires and slowly burned alive. There were many, many shootings. So the chronicle of atrocities is quite a long one and quite a barbarous one.
11th October 1910. The whole thing from top to bottom is slavery without law, the most lawless thing imaginable. I intend taking home, if I can, some of the flogged Indians to convince humane men and women of the dire need for helping these poor people.
While he was in the Putumayo region, he did look out for one or two boys he had the idea that he might take back to London as propaganda for the anti-slavery cause. One day he came across Omarino, and he had had a very tragic experience in that he had witnessed his mother's beheading. Aradomi, the older one, he was reckoned to be 19 or 20, had in fact had his eldest brother killed, and his father had been whipped to death by a Peruvian. He was particularly anxious to come with Casement, and in fact the deal was signed, and Casement bought them for a shirt and a pair of trousers.
A fine muchacho named Aradomi wants to come. Very fine lad. He followed like a dog all afternoon. Gave breeches to him. His beautiful coffee limbs were lovely. Promised to take him home, if I could manage it.
The Daily News reported Aradomi and Omarino's arrival in London on August the 1st, 1911, under the headline, Inferno in a Paradise. The Black Diary records that Casement bought 10 copies. He also presented the boys to the Anti-Slavery Society and commissioned a portrait. Grandstanding around the capital with 2 unfortunate natives was a masterstroke of public relations and lifted the lid on British involvement in the Amazon atrocities. Casement had saved them from slavery, but according to the Black Diaries, he had been seeking out other young men for very different reasons.
30th September 1911. Walked to Old Palace. Squeezed soft, cool hand. Later, a Cabolo. Sturdy lemon gardens. Huge, and he pulled it out. Others came, so I fled, leaving him on a seat without a word.
Perhaps the greatest mystery surrounding these accounts of Casement's sexual adventures is the apparent lack of supporting evidence.
The main reason that these diaries have fallen under suspicion is that they are almost exclusively the only documents associated with Casement which contain a record of homosexual practice. And it has always been, if you like, a strong plank in the forgery theory that given these diaries were held by his prosecutors, and given that they are the only evidence, they would say, of his homosexual activity, then the argument in favour of forgery is very strong.
Historian Angus Mitchell believes the diaries may well be forged and thinks it's inconceivable that Casement could have had such an active sex life.
The plausibility of the diaries is a big problem, because when you actually travel on the Amazon, as a white man, most things about you are known. Casement was making perilous investigations of atrocities. Arana had his spies all up and down the river. They wanted to get Casement on anything they possibly could. So it's very difficult to believe that he, whilst carrying out those investigations during his journeys up the Amazon in 1910 and 11, was also carrying on this promiscuous sex life.
Forgery theorists also point to the existence of another Casement diary from the same period which, interestingly, contains no sexual references.
This is what's known as the White Diary, and it's kept in the National Library of Ireland in Dublin, and then part of the diary has been loaned to me for the purpose of this examination. Now, I understand the entire White Diary is about 200 sheets, and I've only looked at a very small portion of it. They are written on foolscap pages, and they are clearly very different in nature to what's known as the Black Diaries. Since these documents do bear the same dates as entries in the Black Diaries, it's an obvious process to compare the two together. On the screen here, I've one of the entries from the White Diaries. It's an entry which is dated the 10th of October 1910. And it records some of the events on Roger Casement's journey when he was in a town called Ultimo Retiro. What I want to do is compare the entries here directly with some of the entries in the equivalent section of the Black Diary. So if I can just electronically mix the two entries. We've got Retiro and Retiro here on the screen. You can see here the character, the lead into the character T and the exiting stroke are virtually identical in both characters, and the crossbar at the same level. That's a very good match.
However, it has been suggested that elsewhere there are serious inconsistencies between the two diaries.
For me, one of the most powerful inconsistencies is the question of Casement's eyes. In 1910, when Casement journeys up the river for the first time with the commission, he begins to suffer this terrible eye infection, which grows progressively worse until a point in early October when his eyes are really troubling him to a point where he has to bandage them. And he's terrified of you know, as he says, of going blind in the forest. Now, if you look at the White Diary, his handwriting is quite clearly sort of sinking beneath the line. It's been affected, I would say, by his eye problem. If you read the parallel entries for the Black Diaries of that period, there is no indication whatsoever that his eyes are troubling him at all. I mean, everything is written perfectly along the line. He's also using pencil throughout that period because he finds it easier to write with a pencil and it troubles his eyes less. And the entry in the Black Diary for the day when his eyes are at their very worst is in pen.
One feature that is often encountered in the writing of people who can't see very well or indeed are blind is the inability to actually space words and to put the pen down again on the paper in the correct spot to actually continue with a sentence or a signature. And we don't see any evidence of any lack of spacing or changes in spacing or lack of regularity in these writings. Even though they're large and they appear very fluent and fast, they're still very regular. Looking at this very fluent and well-defined writing, I can't see any evidence that his eyesight or problems with his eyesight are affecting his handwriting.
We are faced with the fact that if all of these diaries are casements, then he actually kept two sets of diaries, some of which were describing either experiences or fantasies, not simply of a homosexual kind, but of a promiscuous, and I think it should be said, highly predatory kind. The kind which really would use human beings as a sexual commodity.
The suggestion that Casement was predatory had serious implications for his reputation as a humanitarian.
The idea of a gay humanitarian must be true in countless cases. Many saints have been gay and been devout humanitarians. But it's a different thing altogether if you're talking about somebody whose view of other people is their sexual exploitation, and who seems at certain stages to be totally obsessive about the whole thing, and moreover is preoccupied about things like lengths of penises and things of that nature. It suggests a mind who can't think of human beings save for purposes of exploitation. It suggests somebody, as it were, who looks at a human being almost entirely for the purposes of sexual gratification. And that doesn't make much sense with what you know about Casement otherwise.
According to this view, accepting the diaries as genuine also means accepting that Casement was a hypocrite who was sexually exploiting the very people he was supposed to be saving.
Casement's reputation with regard to his humanitarian work is in no way affected by the Black Diaries, and it has been suggested that he's predatory towards the natives. That's an absolute nonsense. Nothing occurs anywhere with anyone who is underage or without consent. That is a nonsense. Under present law, Casement wouldn't have had any trouble at all. At the height of his writing that Black Diary, he's got these two Indians in his possession. They're absolutely in his power. And he fancies them too. But, no, not a finger is laid where it shouldn't be laid. And I think that the Black Diary is actually a very good testimony to his not being a paedophile and not being predatory on the natives. His attitude to the natives remains exactly the same, whatever document you're reading.
In fact, the Black Diaries contain no explicit details of any sexual encounters with the native Indians, and these photographs, which are believed to have belonged to Casement, suggest that he was much more interested in young, urban men. Casement's Putumayo report was published in July 1912. Newspapers heaped praise on him for exposing another terrible scandal, and he was knighted, an award he graciously accepted. Great play was made of this during his trial.
He did become a hero in England because what he was doing was seen as a wonderful exhibition of empire at its best. There he was, waving the British flag and stamping out slavery. He got a knighthood for it, and there was a sermon praising him in Westminster Abbey. All good Englishmen should be like this man, this Irishman. And he really was quite a celebrity.
But at the height of his fame, Casement was gripped by an obsession that would lead to his eventual execution: Ireland. The most pressing political issue of the day was Home Rule, and Casement's natural sympathies were with the Irish nationalists.
The Irish have, at that period, a split personality in terms of where their loyalties lie. Ireland, at the beginning of the 20th century, was part of the British Empire. Therefore, the Irish loyalty should have lain with the Empire. But at the same time, there was this nationalist movement emerging and a loyalty towards that too. And Casement is a classic figure whose identity is split between those opposing forces.
Independence for Ireland would become the last consuming cause of Casement's life. His bitter experiences in the colonies had convinced him that his fellow Irishmen were just as much victims of imperial greed as the Africans and the Amazonian Indians. In June 1913, he wrote,
"The white Indians of Ireland are heavier on my heart than all the Indians of the rest of the earth."
2 months later, he resigned from the Foreign Office.
The connection between oppressed Indians and oppressed Irishmen actually came about because he was in Connemara and he saw peasant children affected by typhus. And it reminded him, the squalor of their circumstances, it reminded him of the sort of thing he'd witnessed in the Putumayo. And that's when he coined the expression, the white Indians of Connemara. And it definitely was a sort of third phase, Congolese, Amazonians, Irish.
By the end of 1913, Ireland was at a crossroads. The Ulster Protestants had sworn to oppose Home Rule, by force if necessary. Casement, in response, committed himself to supporting the nationalist Irish Volunteers.
He became active in Irish nationalist politics very late, only when he retired from the Foreign Office. Now, at the end of 1913, he was a free man. He could do what he liked, and he threw himself into spreading the Irish volunteer movement throughout Ireland, making speeches, writing articles, trying to raise money, going off to the United States. Here was an international figure concerning himself with Irish nationalist politics, and he was quite a catch. He was a prestige figure moving into what for many people was a small, narrow world, and here he was trailing clouds of glory from the Congo and Peru.
Casement's devotion to the nationalist cause was taking him into dangerous and uncharted territory. In July 1914, the Irish Volunteers received a huge shipment of rifles, and it was Casement who helped organize it. But gun running was just the beginning. In October 1914, 2 months after war was declared, Casement set out for neutral Norway, but his real destination was Berlin, where he was to begin secret negotiations with the Germans. His plan was to persuade Irish prisoners of war to join a nationalist rebel brigade. They would be supplied with guns by the Germans and transported home to lead an armed revolt against British rule in Ireland.
Initially, Casement's position in Germany is quite strong. He gets the Germans onto the side of the Irish independence movement. But then gradually, his negotiations and his relationship with Germany does disintegrate, and he becomes tremendously disillusioned with Germany and the whole direction of the war. And that leads to clearly a nervous breakdown.
Casement had overreached himself. His appeals to the Germans met with complete indifference, and his attempts to form a rebel brigade were a disaster.
His idea of recruiting Irish prisoners of war to fight against the British was absurd, and it was carried out in a most incompetent manner. I mean, it would have made perfect sense for him to have nobbled likely prisoners of war one by one. But instead he addressed them all, so that those who were deeply opposed to the idea, the majority, were able to impose their views, intimidate, encourage their colleagues. He got virtually no recruits.
The back of Casement's plan was already broken when, in April 1916, a U-boat delivered him ashore at Banner Strand on the southwest coast of Ireland. He had failed to raise his volunteer army and realized the civil uprising was doomed to fail. When the first shots were fired in Dublin on Easter Monday, Casement was in London, a traitor imprisoned in the Tower.
Roger Casement was in a very low state of mind by the time he got to the Tower. Many years later, I managed to track down a corporal of the 1st Battalion of the Welsh Guards who was actually put in the cell with Roger Casement to make sure he didn't take his life while he was in such a depressed state.
He was laying on a bed in the corner, half cocked up, and I thought I'd break up into a conversation with him. Well, he said, I'm dying. I'm going to die a horrible death, he said. What? I said. Well, he said, I've been swallowing crook nails, he says. He said, it'll tear my intestines. Crook nails? Where do you get the nails from? I said. He said, I got them from the fireplace where they used to come in and light the fire in the morning with the wood. Apart from that, he says, I've injected some poison into my bloodstream. He said, I'm afraid it's too late. He says, I'm supposed to be a traitor. He says, I'm not a traitor, he said, I'm an Irish rebel.
As it was, Casement's attempts at suicide were unsuccessful. But the diary pages that would seal his fate were soon in circulation. Forgery and black propaganda were two of the favourite techniques of the British during the First World War. However, intelligence experts point out that 5 volumes of forged material represent literally years of painstaking and quite unnecessary work.
The first thing that I think has to be demonstrated is that British intelligence at any time in its entire history ever produced a forgery which compares with the Casement diaries. The second thing that has to be demonstrated is why it would even try in 1916. The evidence, after all, which convicted Roger Casement had nothing to do with the Black Diaries. What the Black Diaries were used for, primarily, was to discredit Casement. But you didn't need to produce this extraordinary Black Diary to do that. 1 or 2 letters to and from him, showing that he had engaged in what were considered at the time unnatural practices, would have been enough.
There is another possible explanation. Could diaries belonging to Casement have had incriminating sexual passages written into them?
I've looked at the pages of the individual documents to determine if there are any features of those pages which are not visible to the unaided eye, which might betray whether there'd been any alteration or deletion or additions. One of the features of the documents which I looked for were the possible presence of any impressions in the pages using the electrostatic detection apparatus. The impressions could have been caused just by other writings being made on documents whilst resting on top of the diaries, or perhaps by actually erasing entries which were previously present in the diary. And those examinations have proved to be completely negative. There is no evidence that the documents have been substantially tampered with in any way at all.
At the end of his 4-day trial, Casement was found guilty and duly sentenced to death. Speaking from the dock, he made a passionate protest against the legitimacy of the trial and of British rule in Ireland. He was hanged on the 3rd of August 1916 and buried in quicklime. He was 51. His life had come to an ignominious end, but his march to martyrdom was just beginning. The sense of injustice in Ireland grew gradually stronger, and the suspicions of British foul play were only further aroused by official denials that the Black Diaries even existed.
The fact that the existence of the diaries was not confirmed by the British authorities for so long fed into the feeling that they were concealing something, that there was some dirty work afoot. And I think there's still a reasonable current of opinion in Ireland which would like to see the diaries proven forgeries.
A bearer party of army and police officers escorts the gun carriage. The people have come out to honor Roger Casement for doing what he had to do in the name of liberty in 3 continents.
By the time his remains were returned to Ireland in 1965, Casement had become a powerful symbol of Irish Republican sentiment. President Eamon de Valera, himself a veteran of the Easter Rising, defied doctors' orders to attend the reinterment ceremony.
Now, on his last journey, the flag of the Republic is lowered in honor of a man whose tragic story moved the poet W.B. Yeats to write, "Come speak your bit in public, that some amends be made to this most gallant gentleman that is in quicklime laid."
Thanks to Yeats and various other people who write poems about him, he has become rather more of a hero than some of the other heroes of the Easter Rising. A sort of mystique had come around him. He became almost a sacred thing.
The suspicion of forgery has never gone away, but for whatever reason, de Valera was never anxious to obtain definitive proof.
Despite the demands of Irish governments that the diaries be released, that they be examined, there was an underlying unease, uncertainty. Suppose, after all, they're genuine. What then? De Valera's famous remark that Roger Casement's reputation is secure in the hearts of the Irish people is probably something that, at one level, he meant, but he might also have had an underlying fear that some Irish nationalists might think ill of him, might think less of him, if the diaries were proved to be genuine. Perhaps it might be better not to carry out investigations in that area. Perhaps it might be better to leave the diaries as yet another grievance against the British.
In May 2000, the Irish Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, made a personal appeal for independent forensic tests to finally determine the truth about the Casement diaries. The results of these tests can now be revealed.
The unequivocal and confident conclusion which the Giles Document Laboratory has reached is that each of the 5 documents collectively known as the Black Diaries is exclusively the work of Roger Casement's hand, without any reason to suspect either forgery or interpolation by any other hand. The diaries are genuine throughout and in each instance.
In subjecting the diaries to a full and thorough forensic examination, Dr. Giles found so many similarities with Casement's genuine handwriting and so few differences that the conclusion was inescapable. It is clear that Roger Casement did write the Black Diaries. The challenge now is to look beyond the controversy, to understand their wider meaning.
I think what we've done today with the report has brought an end to uncertainty. I hope this doesn't mean the last word in the sense that people are going to give up thinking about this matter. There are a lot of important things to be done as a consequence of these findings. Looking at the diaries, what they now mean, we know that they are unambiguously and totally Casement's. This is an opportunity to reassess the man, his humanitarian achievements, the great privations he lived through, his personal life.
I think the effect of the conclusions today is that it will begin to help people more generally in Ireland to begin to face the homosexuality of Casement, a person who was in many ways revered and looked up to, but with a withholding of judgment on the sexuality issue. I think it will help more people to begin to face that issue.
But the fact that the diaries are genuine does not make the smear campaign that condemned Casement any less despicable.
It seems to me the grosser act to find a man's private diaries and circulate them after he's been sentenced to death. That seems to be a more cowardly act than to take the risk of fabricating something, to take the risk of being found out in your forgery, but at least to show the courage of taking the risk. What was done in 1916 seems to be not only blackguardism, but cowardice.
I do think this is a good thing, and I do hope that it will put the controversy out of things so that we can concentrate on Casement's contribution to the anti-slavery movement, particularly in Africa, which is what he was really all about. This, I know it won't go away, but this issue has really involved too many people for too long. We should now think of the real things in Casement's life.
I hope that Sir Roger will be remembered largely for his humanitarian work, for the work that he did in sort of opening the eyes of the Western world, the civilized world, to the abuses that were being carried out in the name of so-called civilization, exploiting native people in Africa and South America. I think that's his real achievement.
On the 6th of June 1916, Roger Casement wrote to his uncle from his cell in the Tower.
Someday, a rather interesting account of my doings will see the light, I hope, although I shall not be able to revise the proofs, but it will show a side to the picture that people now in this jaundiced time don't understand. I have left a pretty full record.
For more on Roger Casement and the Black Diaries, visit the History website at bbc.co.uk/history.